Schenken per steak in this. A little for me. A little for you. Hey everyone, how's it going? It's Kenji. Today we're gonna cook a real big steak for two. So I always feel that if you're gonna cook a steak, you can get your steak cut, say, 3/4 of an inch thick, and that's a reasonable size for a single person. But rather than getting two 3/4 inch steaks for two people, I think it's always better to get one thick steak so you get a nice sort of contrast between the crust and a good layer of meat on the inside that's still medium rare. This is a steak that's grass-fed, grass-finished, ribeye, with the bone still in. I got this from my friend Kevin Smith, the butcher at Beast and Cleaver here in Seattle. Excellent place to get your meat. What you're looking for in a ribeye, by the way. So the ribeye is made up of two distinct muscle groups. There's here, this is the loin. So this is the same muscle that runs along your backbone here. So this is the muscle that eventually would turn into the New York strip. And then the other part that you have is called the decal or the spinalis. And that's the part around the outside of it. This right here is actually sort of my favorite cut, my favorite bit of meat on the steer. And so when you're looking for a ribeye, I like to find ones from the chuck end, which is closer to the shoulder of the steer. Those ones are gonna have a bigger bit of this decal and a smaller piece of the loin, although of course that's all completely up to your personal taste. All right, so the first thing I'm gonna do with the ribeye is I'm gonna season it. I got kosher salt here. We're gonna go pretty heavily. I always, I like to liken it. I grew up in, I was born in Boston, grew up in New York and New England. I like to say that the salt looks like a New England snow flurry on an empty parking lot. So if you're familiar with what that looks like, that's what you should go for. But otherwise, you just go about this amount. I'm doing salt, black pepper. Some people will tell you not to put pepper on until the end because it can burn when you're searing your steak. I, however, don't mind the flavor of pepper that's been lightly charred or even burnt in a pan. So I go first, but of course you can do it whichever way you prefer. Leave the pepper till the end if you want. And then finally, I'm also going to do a little bit of MSG. So this is about you can do different ratios, but I'm doing about a 5-to-1 ratio salt to MSG. This one, again, totally optional, but it is going to sort of boost the natural umami flavor of the steak. All right, so at this stage we got a couple of options for how to cook it. We could do it the traditional way that you would do in a restaurant where you just sear it and then finish it in an oven. That'll work just fine. What we're gonna do today is a technique that I worked on back in 2007 at Cooks Illustrated. It's called the reverse sear. And so what we do here is we're gonna start it in a low temperature oven, and then we're gonna finish it by searing it. The reason we do that is because by doing it that way, you get a much more even cook from edge to center, so you get more of the sort of medium rare meat as opposed to the traditional way, which gives you sort of more of like a bullseye pattern where the very center is rare and it gets progressively more and more cooked on the way out. The other thing we're gonna do is we're gonna let the steak actually rest. So when you salt a steak, what happens is that initially the salt is going to pull out moisture through osmosis. So it's going to pull moisture out of the meat, and then you're going to see that moisture start to beat up on the surface. So within about 10 minutes or so, there's going to be some pretty heavily beating of water on the surface here. If you try and cook the steak when there's all that surface moisture on it, what happens is it sucks heat away from the pan, so it takes a lot of energy to evaporate liquid. If you take a single drop of water, the amount of energy it takes to take that water from 0 degrees to 100 degrees Celsius, so all the way from freezing to the boiling temperature, it takes 5 times that much energy again to then boil that same drop of water. So it takes a ton of energy to boil water. So what you don't want to do is cook meat when it has a ton of surface moisture on it. You want to make sure it's dry. So you have two options. You can either sear it straight away, or you can do what I'm going to do, which is I'm going to let it rest. And so what's going to happen is initially that salt is going to draw out moisture, and then eventually that salty brine that forms on the surface of the steak is going to start breaking down some of the muscle proteins in the steak, and it's going to reabsorb that moisture. And moreover, because those muscle proteins have been broken down, they don't tighten up as much when they cook, and so that moisture doesn't get re-expressed at the same level. So you get a moisture steak, and you get better, more penetrative seasoning. I'm going to set this aside for about 45 minutes. That's about the minimum amount of time that it takes for that to happen. You can, if you prefer, set it aside in the fridge overnight, uncovered, just like this. And what'll happen is that the surface will sort of dry out and get a little bit of like a pellicle, so that it'll sear even better. But 45 minutes is enough, and that's what I'm going to do right now. So I will see you again in 45 minutes. All right, so it's been about 45 minutes. You can see the moisture on the steak is mostly gone. In this case, we're going to be reverse searing it. It's going to go into the oven, so the surface moisture doesn't matter too much, but we do want to give some time for that salt to penetrate into there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stick a thermometer in there. I'm using the combustion. My buddy Chris Young makes this thermometer. It is it has like sensors all up and down its surface, so it'll tell you by itself like what the coolest part in the center of the steak is. It'll also tell you how long it's going to take using some kind of fancy math thing. It'll tell you how long it's going to take. Anyhow, thermometer in there, and then this is going to go into a real low temperature oven. So you could go as low as 200 degrees or even lower if your ovens can hold a steady temperature lower than that. I'm going to put it in at around 250 or so because I don't want it to take like 6 hours to do. It's only going to take a couple hours instead. The idea for this, by the way, I'm going to put this into my secret oven in the closet. And we'll just monitor the temperature from here. I want the temperature to come to an internal temperature of, I'm looking for around 120 to 125 here. So 120 will be pretty rare, 125 will be medium rare, 130 will be closer to medium, and then on up from there. So with a cut like a ribeye that has a relatively high amount of fat, I like to actually go a little bit higher than rare, so I would tend to aim towards medium rare to medium. Whereas with something that's leaner, like say a fillet, a tenderloin, I would go more towards I would err more towards the rare side, so more towards the 120 to 125 degree mark. So the idea for this, by the way, the idea for this reverse sear steak, this was back in 2006 that I started working on this recipe. I had been working in restaurants up until about a year before that, and at the time, that was when sous vide just started to get introduced to the market. So the idea behind sous vide is that you take, back then it was always meat. Now you can do, now people have experimented doing vegetables and stuff with it. But you would take a piece of meat, put it in a plastic bag, suck out all the air from it, and then put it in a water bath that was circulating and kept at a real precise temperature. So the idea is that you would cook the meat at the temperature that you wanted to serve it. So for example, if you wanted your steak to be a medium rare 125 degrees, you would set the water bath temperature to exactly 125 degrees. You put the steak in there, and then you let the water circulate around it until the entire thing was 125 degrees edge to center. And then finally at the end, you would take it out of the bag, pat it dry, and sear it. And the idea is that you get like evenly cooked meat all the way from edge to center. And so when I was at Cooks Illustrated, I was thinking to myself, this was actually the very first recipe I ever worked on as a recipe developer. I was thinking to myself, how can we sort of emulate that process at home? Because at the time, sous vide machines were sort of in the $1,500 to $2,000 range. These days you can get them for like, $79. But they were real expensive back then, definitely not a home cooked tool. So the question was, how do you get a similar result without the special tool? And so that's where this technique came, where we started in a low temperature oven. We slowly bring the meat up to the right temperature. In this case, I'm going to 125 degrees. And then afterwards, we sear it at the end, sort of. And years later, someone renamed the process the reverse sear because you're doing it sort of the reverse process of what is traditional. Anyhow, that is the story of the reverse sear. I'm not the first person to ever have done it. I think Alton Brown and Heston Blumenthal had recipes for reverse seared large cuts of meat, like roasts and stuff like that, a couple years prior to that. And if you go over to AmazingRibs.com, my friend Meathead Goldwyn, he's got a sort of entire history of the reverse sear. In any case, it's a relatively modern process. Like people weren't really doing this 25 years ago, 30 years ago. All right, so that steak, it's gonna take a couple hours in the oven. Depending on the oven temperature, if you go up to 275 degrees or 300 degrees, it might only take an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. If you go down to say 150 degrees, it's gonna take you like 6 hours for a cut of meat that big. Here it's gonna probably take a couple hours. So I will be back when that meat hits its target temperature, and I'll see you then. Okay, so that steak, let me go into my secret toaster, my secret oven closet. That steak has now hit an internal temperature of 122 degrees, according to the thermometer. So I'm going to pull it out, and you can see at this point, it doesn't look particularly great. It's not very brown. There's not much of a crust on it, but that's okay. What we did the first step was to get the internal temperature exactly where we want it. And now what we're going to do is we're going to finish it off by searing it. So I'm going to dry off the surface. Again, you want to you want as dry a surface as possible when you're searing a steak. All right? And then you want as heavy a pan as possible. So a lot of people will recommend you use a saute pan, you know, something with a sloped sides, shallow. In fact, in the past, I've recommended that as well. These days, I actually prefer to do it in a deeper thing, like a brazier or even in a Dutch oven, mainly because it'll contain some of the splatter and it heats up just as well. It's going to sear the steak just as well. So this is a real heavy Staub cast iron brazier. I'm going to start with some oil. It should be smoking hot, your highest heat. And then we're going to get the steak right in there. All right. I'm also going to add some butter to there. And you're going to see this butter actually is going to burn. It's going to start to brown real fast. Some people don't like the flavor of dark butter solids, like sort of blackened butter solids. I find with a steak, it's totally acceptable to have a little bit of that sort of charred, burnt flavor, whether it's the charred beef fat or whether it's charred butter. I find it's totally fine to do. I'm also going to add some garlic cloves, some shallots, and some thyme sprigs. Okay, at this point, let me flip over that steak so you can see how fast that crust developed. I'm going to get that thyme and the garlic and the shallots on top of there. We're just going to do a little bit of basting. So I'm going to lean the pan so that butter pools a bit and then spoon it right on top. You might notice that I took the steak straight out of the oven and into the pan. If your guests are not quite ready to eat, you know, if say you need like an extra half hour, you guys are in the middle of a good game of set or something, you can leave the steak sitting at room temperature for up to 45 minutes or so before you sear it. So you have like a nice window of time between the first part of the cooking and the second part of the cooking. So you don't have to worry too much about the timing being precise. It'll work no matter what. All right, so we got both sides seared, and we're going to finish it off by searing the edges. This pan, by the way, it's a collaboration between Staub and my friend Deb Perlman of Smitten Kitchen. We have a podcast together. It's called The Recipe. But she collaborated with Staub to make this pan, and I use it all the time now. And I'm not just saying that; I really do. All right. So our steak is going to go right back onto the rack. I'm going to put this thyme and garlic and all the other aromatics right back on top. We're going to finish it off by taking the smoking hot fat and pouring it right over the top. This is going to give it a nice little sizzle. Now, with most steak cooking techniques, at this stage you would want to let your steak rest a bit. However, with the reverse sear, you don't need to do that. So the reason you need to let your steak rest is because you want the internal temperature to sort of normalize. So when you're cooking with a really high heat and cooking it all the way through with really high heat, you end up with a temperature gradient in there where, you know, the outside of the steak's going to be really, really hot, the center of the steak's going to be cooler, and so resting it allows that temperature to normalize. It lets the hottest parts cool down a little bit so that the juices solidify a little more, and that way your steak doesn't sort of leak juice out everywhere as soon as you cut into it. With the reverse sear or with sous vide or any other sort of slow method where you're only searing for a very short time at the very end, you don't need to do any of that stuff because it's already a relatively normalized temperature all the way through. So at this stage, we can let it rest. We can let it sit here for, you know, up to, say, 15 minutes or so. It'll still be nice and hot when we serve it, or we can cut right into it. And in this case, I'm going to cut right into it. Look at that. Look how beautiful that is. Should we cut it open and see what we got? Oof. Look at that. So you can see here, evenly cooked all the way from edge to center, a real nice sear on it, but that's a sort of perfect medium rare for me. Right at the point where the fat starts to really get nice and juicy and liquidy, but not to the point where the meat is starting to turn gray or overcooked or tough. Ready to taste? All right. One thing to remember with steak is that the outside is seasoned, but the inside is not, so I always like to serve it with a little bit of fancy sea salt, give it a little bit of crunch, make sure that every bit of it is seasoned properly. That is seriously good. All right. If you're going to spend a lot of money on a piece of meat, you don't want to mess it up. For me, reverse sear is the way to go with a steak this size. All right, guys, gals, non-binary pals, enjoy your steak for two. Oh, wait, Chen, do you want to? So far, I'm only one. Chen can partake in this. All right, Chen, here. A little for me. A little for you. All right. Guys, gals, non-binary pals, four-legged friends, steak for two. The key here was we seasoned it in advance, salt, pepper, a little bit of MSG. We let that salt sit there and penetrate for a while. Then we started in a low temperature oven, let it come all the way up to 122 degrees in this case. You can go a little higher, a little lower, depending on how you like it. We finish it in a real hot and heavy pan for a nice sear. Oil, butter, I did some aromatics. Aromatics are optional. And then you serve it. No resting, just cut into it and eat. All right, see you later. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video. You can find the full article and recipe along with bonus content and my newsletter for free on my Patreon. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel for more videos like this, or my alternate channel, Kenji Lopez Main, for my dining content. And follow me on Instagram at Kenji Lopez-Alt for daily updates. You can also get signed and personalized copies of any of my books. That's The Food Lab, The Walk, or my children's book, Every Night is Pizza Night, shipped from Booklarder here in Seattle. Find the links to all of this, as well as all of the tools I used in today's video, in the description below. Thanks.